The other issue is because we've got quite a short time, we'd like to actually put questions into the chat, and we'll try and answer those at the end of the session. If we haven't got time, we'll get back to people specifically with answers to those questions at the end of the session. So welcome to the session this morning, and we'll start the presentation and interaction. Could we start with the presentation, please? Right, so this session is entitled Clean Growth Hubs, the Economic Benefits of Collaboration. This is part of what's called the cluster plan in particular. That cluster plan does consist of 30 partners, and one or two of the partners are here today to actually contribute to this. Next slide, please. The agenda today is, some of you may never have heard CR+, so there'll be literally a 1-minute skip through CR+. Why are we even thinking of clean growth hubs? What the concept is. Then we've got Ralph Windia from AB Ports giving us an example of what a clean growth hub could actually begin to look like, using Barry Port as an example. We've then got Andrew Price from CR+, a colleague who will actually just take you through very quickly some of the bolt-on sort of business opportunities, technologies that could actually go around what we call an anchor site and actually build out a concept of a clean growth hub, which basically means you align businesses and technologies and opportunities at net zero carbon from the outset. Then we'll summarise the session with what do clean growth hubs mean from a Welsh perspective or a South Wales perspective. Next slide, please. So CR+, the CR doesn't stand for carbon reduction, probably would have been appropriate, but we did set up the company quite a while back. It's actually cost reduction, which does mean that we tend to focus on business cases and what actually adds value. We are a small company that is actually headquartered in Baglan in South Wales, so we are serving the community. We're very much hands-on. We do get involved in the plant, so we're not typically a high-level strategic company. So we're probably approaching this sort of work in a slightly different context. But we do believe that context actually provides us with a very holistic and integrated approach. So in other words, our ultimate goal is to actually deliver decarbonisation that has a business case, and we feel that will actually engage UK industry and South Wales industry in particular. Next slide, please. So why are we even looking at clean growth hubs? This slide's a bit information packed. You probably can't see the top left-hand quadrant, but in actual fact, the top line on that graph is what's called consumption CO2. So the time frame from that is roughly 1970 to current day. And as you can see, our consumption of CO2 in the UK is broadly the same. So have we actually saved, have we minimised our CO2 impact? What's happened, the lower line, the one that's creating the gap from the 1980s onwards, is effectively saying how our CO2 for the UK is actually dropping in terms of emissions. So the gap is effectively what's our offshoring. So people talk about offshoring of our carbon responsibility. Probably that graph is actually demonstrating that. So one way that we've actually looked at this situation when we're looking at decarbonisation. The easy way to actually decarbonise the industry in particular is to close it down on the UK. Then we actually meet our targets. So what we're actually proposing is not just protecting our existing industry, but maybe starting to bring some of those industries that have been offshored, bring them back to the UK where it makes sense. Not every industry coming back to the UK does make sense globally. So we've actually got to be quite clever as to which does make sense globally and which makes sense local supply chains, etc. So it is quite a complex picture. So what we've got to decide is, what are we good at? What are the opportunities? What are the innovations we do want to push? And actually what provides local prosperity, especially for future generations. So in essence, we can't really offload our responsibilities anymore. That top graph is saying, although we're appearing to drop off in terms of consumption emissions, probably what's not up to date is the last part of that curve, which actually is showing we are starting to reduce our consumption a bit as well. You can see a slight tail off on the graph. So Wales has introduced world-leading policies in areas such as well-being of future generations, recycling, etc. And we want to use that within the cluster plan to actually build concepts and ideas and support that general strategy. What we've also found out so far within the work in the cluster plan especially is there is no single silver bullet. There's usually a variety of solutions, and some Andrew, my colleague, will speak about later, that will provide different solutions in different situations, therefore helping communities and industry in different ways. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So what's the actual concept? Generally, what we're trying to do within South Wales is work off our existing anchor sites. We tend to then ripple out. So when you look at this, you may be into an anchor site, have input materials and energy into that site. And we end up with various waste vectors coming off that site. And what we're trying to do is squeeze them and look for symbiotic industries that either supply into that anchor site or actually can work off the streams that come off that anchor site. What we'll probably look at as well is trying to bring all those together ultimately into a cohesive plan across South Wales, but for the purposes of this session, we're actually putting the boundary at the Clean Growth Hub. From this, we think we can actually get substantial growth within South Wales, and we'll come to that later in the session. What we will do is hopefully, if Richard could press the short animation, which just gives an overview. There's no sound on this, so I'll keep quiet. Okay, that's basically what that sort of, the animation was a little bit juddery and jilted looking at it. So there is actually a YouTube site where it can be looked at, and I think the quality will be better for those that want to have a quick look. What is a Clean Growth Hub? Actually, there was a presentation yesterday done by a colleague that included a complex picture of vectors for the Welsh proposition for getting to net zero carbon. And I think we shouldn't shy away from the fact that actually net zero is going to be a complex picture. And what this slide is, and I'm not going to go through it, is, but there's a series of boxes around various aspects, and it's coming back to the fact that we can create business cases within an anchor site, within a small area. We can then actually take these vectors out to homes, to the domestic situation, to commercial public sectors. So in other areas, we are actually looking at schools and hospitals being part of these growth hubs. There's possibilities around transport as well and linking into it. So the picture is a little bit wider than just industry. And I think that's part of what the South Wales Industrial Cluster is actually that wider networking and bringing together something other than just industry. So we're not just introspective. Next slide, please. This is just a picture of geographically what a clean growth hub could look like. You can see there's various colours. I'm slightly colourblind, so if I get some of this wrong, apologies. But effectively, we've got an area in the centre there that's hopefully blue with 1, 2, 3. This sort of clean growth hub is more energy centre based. So in other words, we're actually looking at providing all the energy, clean energy provision from a central base. And then basically we're moving to high temperature processes in the red section. Then we ripple out into the grey where we're using some of the lower heat vectors that come from the energy centre. We've also got a green sector, the all-important parking and things for the people that will be working in these clean growth hubs. And with the transition to battery electrical vehicles, bikes, there will be liquid biogenic transport fueling points. All those will be catered within that. Then effectively there will be potential for adding on, if there is residual low-grade heat, to district heat network, heat pump applications. Basically, we can get more out of heat pump applications if we're at least applying 30, 40, 50 degrees waste heat. So in reality, this sort of application can be applied to a large number of industrial estates, especially, or anchor sites in South Wales. I'll come to that later. Next slide, please. At this point, I'll hand over to Ralph Windia from AV Ports.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you this morning about clean growth hubs. In my short slot, I'm going to try and explain the way that we see ports being able to contribute to the green revolution that's required as a nation for us to deliver net zero, a pretty significant challenge. You can move us on to the next slide, please, Katrina. Ports have the potential to stimulate a modern day transformation of the economy based on clean growth. Many of our ports in South Wales were actually developed originally around the first industrial revolution, but they can be part of a cleaner growth, moving away from hydrocarbons. I'm going to start just with a very quick intro to the organisation I represent, ABP, for those that aren't familiar with it. So ABP, leading ports operator in the UK, 21 ports around the coast of England, Wales and Scotland, as you can see on the map on the right hand side. Also highlights in yellow the 5 ports we operate in South Wales, which, working from east through to the west, are Newport, Cardiff, Barry, Port Talbot and Swansea. Those ports handle a real diverse range of different cargoes, from dry bulks, liquid fuels, break bulk products like steel and timber, and all of those products serve a range of different industries across the South Wales area and up into the Midlands. A number of those industries are members of the South Wales Industrial Cluster with us, so their decarbonisation is important to the ports from a range of different angles. The ports in South Wales are characterised by some very large estates. As you can see on the slide, there's about 3,500 acres of port estate across the 5 locations, which are a real legacy from the industrial era, but provide a real opportunity for us to use the development land that sits around our ports as part of this transformation. As you can see, between us and our customers, the ports directly and indirectly support 15,000 jobs and contribute something like 1.4 billion GBA to the economy. So they're a major economic driver today. And they're very expensive assets to own and operate ports. Our owners spend hundreds of £1 million a year in infrastructure, upgrading some of the Victorian and Edwardian infrastructure that the ports were founded on, as well as on growth projects to deliver solutions for new customers. So it's an expensive hobby, owning and operating ports. If you can move us to the next slide, please, Katrina. So very quickly, I just want to frame what modern ports do, often perceived in quite a traditional way as being an area simply where goods come on and off of ships, traditionally seen as being quite industrial and quite dirty locations, but modern ports already do quite a lot more than that. So I've highlighted 4 themes here on the slide just to talk very quickly about. So firstly, in the upper left, the statutory role. Our teams do a very good job, very important job in keeping all of the thousands of shipping movements in and out of the South Wales ports operating in a safe fashion by dredging and marking navigation channels from a conservancy perspective, providing pilotage services to bring vessels in and out. A really important part of the sort of front door part of port activity. In the upper right hand side, the transit of cargo, again, very much a part of the traditional view of ports, but we provide infrastructure for doing that. So you can see in the image just in from the left, example of a deep water jetty and Cape-sized ships to berth at Port Talbot, where the raw materials are coming inbound to supply Tata Steel's integrated steelworks adjacent to the port. We also provide services that make the infrastructure work in terms of stevedoring and cargo handling, so your traditional discharging and loading of ships. And the image in the upper right, an example of some of the more niche, different types of cargo that we handle with locomotives being discharged directly from a ship onto rail. The lower half of this slide are probably some of the more contemporary types of use and less traditional from the uses that you probably will be familiar with ports. So in the bottom left, that legacy development estate provides opportunities for us to undertake a lot of value-added activities on the port. And these can be across a range of different applications from processes like bagging cargoes, screening, blending different types of cargo. We've got examples of manufacturing processes that happen here on the port, on the development areas that we've got available to us that allow value to be added, additional employment to be created around the supply chains that are flowing through the port, rather than just goods simply passing through. And then an increasingly important feature you can see highlighted in the bottom right, renewable energy generation. A number of the ports have their own private electricity networks, which have renewable energy generation assets in terms of onshore wind, ground-mounted solar and roof-mounted solar connected to them to allow us to power the port operations in a more green way, but also supply power to some of those value-added activities from green sources. Could you move us to the next slide, please, Katrina? So turning to how ports can actually support the development of clean growth hubs. Again, a number of different themes highlighted on this slide, but starting in the upper left, ports are great places for the production of alternative energy. There's a few reasons for this from our perspective, that they're already to a degree industrial settings, that they've got the right sort of character of development around them. They've got lots of connecting transport infrastructure, which is useful for the distribution of those fuels, but also in the sense of creating a demand. That the majority of our ports are trimodal, which combines road transport, rail transport, and maritime transport. So for distributing those fuels, you've got an existing transport infrastructure, but you've also got potential users that are starting and finishing journeys at a port. There's a demand from the industrial cluster that sits around those ports as well, for these types of fuels. Members of SWIC and indeed new industries that we might be able to attract to the port on the back of this. And the ports themselves have lots of power. They're generally characterised by having large grid connections, which is pretty important. So we're thinking here of production of green hydrogen and green ammonia. And some of those can also be imported through the deep water infrastructure that we've got. So the example you can see in the upper centre of this image, a sort of view of the future of shipping that's maybe powered by hydrogen. So a particular example with DFDS Seaways is proposals to operate vessels that are powered by hydrogen. And that's neatly linked to what I've got in the upper right-hand side, port-centric manufacturing and distribution. I started to talk about this in terms of the way that we're using development land for value add, but focusing in particularly around manufacturing. The ports are really great places for manufacturing to take place because you've got the ability to bring in raw materials directly to the point of consumption. What that means is that you're cutting out an inward transportation leg associated with cost and carbon. So port-centric means lower cost, lower carbon by its very nature. The example that you can see on the slide there is an artist's impression of the plasterboard factory that's under construction in the port of Newport, whereby the manufacturer will bring in their raw materials through the port of Newport. They will also then have the ability to export their finished product in part by sea, but also to make use of the excellent road and rail connections that I referred to earlier. There's another sort of major area of port-centric manufacturing, which I'll touch on a bit later, around offshore wind, which is quite specific to the assets that we've got in South Wales. And moving then to the bottom, Chris Williams was talking to us yesterday about the potential of CO2 shipping, obviously in terms of the hierarchy of what we'd like to do with CO2, avoidance first, utilisation second, and then sort of storage as the final straw, really, as it were. But the ports have got all of the right infrastructure for the export of CO2. South Wales doesn't benefit from the geological storage being in close proximity as some of the other industrial clusters have got. So shipping is going to be a key component for that for us. So ports can provide some of that infrastructure. It can also provide the development sites for some of the utilisation projects. So the image in the one in from the left-hand side on the bottom, showing Lanzatech, who are one of our other partners here in SWIC, who have got a project to produce sustainable aviation fuels on the port of Port Talbot. You can then combine in the bottom right the manufacturing of various different types of product and the production of alternative fuels with the use of rail connectivity and short sea to distribute those products. Both rail and shipping clearly being a lower CO2 intensity than moving things by road. Once available, alternative fuels are available, we can further decarbonise those modes of transport even further. Next slide, please. So trying to put this into a real example from what Tony's described to you and some of the port examples. This is an aerial view of the port of Barry, image that was put together by the team at CR Plus and Costain to highlight the potential of clean growth hubs. So what you can see here is all of the key ingredients in one place, we think, for what will really make a clean growth hub work. So right at the top of the image, you can see renewable energy generation on the site. So there's a 5 megawatt solar array and a small biomass power station, which has got the ability to provide green power through a private wire arrangement into this hub. In the bottom, you can see there's a very large grid connection coming into this site that was formerly supplying Barry Power Station. So there's a source of power for even more energy intensive use beyond what we've got available to us in the site. Again, this trimodal transport infrastructure here, there's road, rail and sea combined here in the Port of Barry. You can't quite see, but you'll see from my next slide a better view of the rail terminal with intermodal services coming from some of the deep sea ports, Southampton and London Gateway in particular, connecting here by rail, so allowing importers and exporters of products to be connected with the rest of the world outside of Europe. And there's also storage and handling facilities on the port for some of the raw materials that producers might need. So you can see the Navigator fuel terminal highlighted in orange, again in the background of this slide. On the right-hand side, you've got two existing large chemical operations which provide anchor demand for green fuels and provide an opportunity for us to decarbonise some of the existing activities on site. And then in the main part of the middle of the site, you can see some of the larger development areas that we've got, which could sit directly alongside all these assets. So the ability to create clean growth using development site, as brownfield development land that already sits there. And it's really the combination of all these factors together in one place that creates something special and really creates a development opportunity for us. If you could flick to the next slide, Katrina. This is a slightly different visualization. We're looking at this from a slightly different aspect, but just trying to highlight a little bit more obviously some of those features that I just mentioned. So you can see the solar in red on the right-hand side, the biomass area highlighted in blue. There's another large development site highlighted in green, and then the intermodal terminal in yellow alongside the liquid storage facility that Navigator operate in orange. So all of these things really close together, allowing developers to exploit the fact that all of these things are in one place, which provides significant cost saving, as already mentioned, but also significant reduction in the carbon in their supply chain because they're not moving things a long way inland. Could you move on again, please, Katrina? So why is all this important? I just really wanted to highlight what we see as the benefits of these, or the potential benefits of these clean growth hubs. Clearly, the ability to attract large inward investment opportunities into some priority areas. Some of our ports sit in high priority areas from a regeneration, redevelopment perspective. These clean growth hubs will create highly skilled, well-paid and sustainable jobs. It's a diversification away from the reliance on some of the traditional industries that are quite carbon intensive that we have in this part of the world and highlighted earlier. And really it will create supply chains that will be anchored by the existing operators, but will allow us to attract further future growth into these areas. And all of that is pretty consistent with the so-called levelling up agenda. And the last point, really important for us, in the scale of investment that's going to take part in this green industrial revolution, we want to make sure that some of the value of this investment is captured in the UK and specifically here in Wales rather than being lost overseas. And we see clean growth hubs as a vehicle to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So that was a real quick run through. For those interested to learn more, a shameless plug for our South Wales Vision launch next week. So the South Wales Ports will be launching its Vision and Master Plan next Wednesday. There's details on the web link, and we'll stick it again in the chat. But if there are any questions on the material today, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can today, but encourage people also to join us next Wednesday for that. I mentioned earlier that I touch again on floating offshore wind, which is a particularly important feature of what we'd like to talk to about Port Talbot as a specific type of manufacturing that can benefit from these clean growth hubs. But that Wales Vision will focus on that in particular. So I'm going to pass across now to Andrew Price from CR+, who's going to talk about some further examples. Andrew.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks for that. So yeah, I'm Andrew Price with CR+. Been working on the SWIC projects for a little while now, looking in the sort of energy efficiency, fuel switching, that sort of thing. And I've been working with my colleagues on these clean growth concepts for a little bit now. So just to talk about some of the business cases and the technologies that are sort of applicable that we're talking about, is the co-location of these agile businesses and technologies onto these anchor sites. To, as Tony's been saying, to maximise the use of energy and resources, and we've categorised them into 4 categories. So we've said that the first group is the squeezing of the waste heat. So there's a abundance of waste heat coming out of industries, and it's sort of really looking at those different grades and temperatures of waste heats and matching the technologies to those different grades. There's options for utilising that heat for energy generation, or you can do some process cooling. There's lots of different uses for that waste heat. Then for the group 2, we've talked about material symbiosis, and this is all about using byproducts or waste streams and in the near vicinity and neighbouring sites, shortening the supply chains. And chemical industries have been doing this for a long time, locating next to each other, sort of for that the various byproducts they've got and the waste materials that they've got, and with the sort of the lithium-ion battery recycling that's to come, there's some strategically important materials that could be located next door to existing sites we've got in South Wales. And then we've got the group 3, which is the energy centre structures. So these are centrally located energy centres that can supply heat, electricity, potentially some low carbon fuels to the co-located sites. And also then you've got a single emission point to effectively capture your carbon to do various things with, if it's CC utilisation or storage. And then we've got group 4 is what we're calling pathway projects. So this is almost not waiting for that silver bullet. It's about implementing projects that are viable now, but also that can leave the door open to the future transition to that zero carbon scenario. And in this we're saying that it's not about don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, is what they say. So it's really what can we implement in the short term that will make a difference now, and is almost future-proofed as well. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So for squeezing waste heat potential, so as I said, large amount of waste heat across industry. The first thing you try and do is to recover that heat on your site within the process or within another process on your site. But then by moving these agile technologies and businesses to make use of that surplus heat, then we can make valuable products and reduce the carbon demand of the manufacturer of these projects. So you've got a couple of examples here of things like vertical farming and aquaculture. They typically will need quite a low grade of waste heat, sort of 50 degrees potentially, that sort of range. And you've got heat networks as well, which you can mop up a load of waste heat for that. And I've mentioned a bit of the electricity generation and chilling processes as well. So I think we've got a point at the bottom there, which is saying that decarbonising that initial heat is going to have the biggest carbon impact in the long run, but the economics of it are also very important to consider on that one. If you move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We've got a couple of examples here of partners from the cluster plant. So we've got on the left, you've got the Valley Nickel Refinery with the Rice project. They are using some of their waste CO2 from the process, and there's also an opportunity to use waste heat to optimise some growing conditions and to grow that algae. And there's various applications you've got for algae, from animal feed to high value proteins and dyes and things like that. And I think it says there as well, there's a bit more of a talk on this Thursday morning if you're interested. And then on the right, there's carbonate, and as the name says, they use the waste CO2 to carbonate various minerals and permanently trap that CO2 in building materials. And that one's being talked about in the CCU talk on Thursday afternoon. But it's not just about carbon dioxide with the material symbiosis. There's other opportunities to use different byproducts and shorten those supply chains, where, as both Tony and Ralph have been talking about. If you go on to the next slide, please. So energy strengtheners, yeah. So this really supplying power and heat to small industrial estates, and you can have byproducts in that as well, such as fly ash and other products that carbonate could in particular could use. So in that industrial estate, you've got various off-takers with different demands, different heating requirements, and it's almost that diverse range of processes enables you to really squeeze the energy out of that system to maximise efficiency. You can look at various different types of CHP, and you can involve things like biomass or pyrolysis technology or gasification, and then you can also convert into valuable other products for sale or use in the local vicinity also. Things like local renewable power, as Ralph mentioned with that solar array that was in the Barry port, that can also complement the system as well, and help to really achieve that net zero target for that clean growth hub. If you go on to the next slide, please. So for the pathway projects, it's about what can you implement now. With gas-fired CHP, there's typical refurbishment every sort of 30,000 hours, which is about 4 years time. So there's opportunities there where you can upgrade to enable sort of hydrogen firing compatibility, for example. And these sorts of projects, as I mentioned, they keep the doors open to future improvement or changes. And you've already got your infrastructure there in place that can be converted to clean hydrogen or can enable carbon capture. It's really something that we can get going in the short term that is a pathway to net zero. And as Ralph mentioned, with LanzaTech, they're producing low carbon fuels now, and they are, that's a pathway to the circular carbon approach, and then that's been talked about as part of the CCU discussion on Thursday afternoon. And yeah, so in that supply chain approach, we're talking about retaining the materials and businesses and not offshoring, reshoring. These are all the sort of key messages that we're trying to get across in this clean growth concept, really. And if I just pass on to Tony to summarise into the next slide, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Just to pick up on a couple of points that sort of Ralph has highlighted. One of the things that we'd like to do is focus on not just protecting our industry, but actually providing this economic prosperity. As some of Ralph's slides have shown, that in the past there was industry, there was prosperity in that region. There's now brownfield sites available. Unfortunately, over the last few decades, that the decline in industry has been a trend. So this is quite an ambitious proposal that we're putting forward on clean growth hubs. It's actually bucking the trend. The decline is a trend, so we're not just trying to hold that, or we're actually trying to reverse that trend in the thinking. We think that as the world population grows and there are pulls on resources, that in reality the UK and South Wales could be at risk from supply chain issues. So therefore, part of this is actually self-interest as well for the UK and for UK businesses. How do we retain materials? How do we retain those energy supplies and make the maximum out of it? So economic prosperity is actually at the heart of some of these proposals. It can actually provide, as Ralph mentioned, a diversity of well-paid, skilled jobs, opportunities, not just at the high end. It will be across the broad range of jobs. We will require people that will operate, the trades people, building skills and resources. Skills and resources does form part of this afternoon's session as well, which John Maddy as facilitator is part of. So we actually do realise that we can't just switch new industries in. We actually need to provide the skills and resources to bring that in. We need to be looking at where these localised supply chains are appropriate as well. We can't just assume that everything should be local. There are sometimes good, valid reasons why global supply chains do work. Sometimes you don't want to actually transport air and things like that from local positions. The levelling up aspect that Ralph made reference to earlier is actually something else that certainly in South Wales we've actually got 10 of our local authorities are actually in area assisted A status, and that is, we have deprived areas, but we want to not just provide opportunities for very high skilled jobs in those areas, it's actually providing that full range, so that what we want to make sure is we don't import highly skilled people into the areas to the detriment of actually people that live in those areas as well. We think this concept, looking at other studies, and the Zero 2050 study came out yesterday and made reference to clean growth hubs. So we are actually continuing that work that was started in that project. There was another project that was raised yesterday, transforming foundation industries supported project by Both Eyes Wide Open. One of that aspect looked at materials and energy, and that project was led by ERM. So there's actually a report coming out soon that quantifies some of these waste streams, or starts to. This is a long-term process. We have to actually build that sort of trust between parties. I noticed in the chat, John raised issues about finance, but in actual fact, trust and people's belief that industries will be there for the long term to actually allow that investment. Are local authorities behind that planning? Will they provide the right framework, the right maybe incentives to collect the right sort of industry that will benefit from low-grade waste heat or clean electricity from these energy centres? So it is a collaborative effort, and I would say that we're at the start of that journey. We're certainly not even halfway through that journey. The Minister for Climate Change, Julie James, in her opening statement yesterday, sort of has a wide-ranging portfolio. So it's really recognising the fact that climate change impacts all aspects of our lives. So clean growth hubs can support some of those challenges, some of those areas, and it will provide opportunities for not just businesses but communities as well. And SWIC partners, as was stated yesterday, there are a large number of partners signed up to. There's 3 main projects that have either been completed or ongoing in SWIC at the moment, and they all have double-digit numbers of partners actively participating. So we're starting to build up those levels of trust that will be needed to actually overcome some of the barriers. Early indications when we've started to actually look at what does developing clean growth hubs for South Wales mean? The sort of very high level geospatial diagrams have been constructed probably across about 7 or 8 locations at the moment. We've one of the colleagues, as Ralph mentioned, we're working with Costain on deployment, and David Jukes from Costain just did a quick search basically that identified just in the Cardiff capital region alone, I think something like 40 locations that included the name industrial estate in their title. So that sort of shows how many locations we could be talking about across South Wales. That initial analysis, and with the types of investment we were looking at, we think there could be in excess of £20 billion of inward investment. And when you start looking at creating the jobs, it will be in the tens of thousands ultimately. One small site that we're looking at the moment actually has very light manufacturing with it, but could actually take that industrial estate's working population from 1,800, we think, up to around 5,000. So, but we're in very early sort of conversations in this area. So I think we may be reaching the end. Could I go to the next slide? I think that is the end. Yeah. Could we finish there, please, Katrina? And I'll pass over to John Maddy to collate any questions that have come in and maybe quiz the panel, please.
Thanks, Tony. Just a couple of questions in the chat that I've fielded, or in fact, a couple I put myself. But one was to Ralph, and if this is a bit political, then forgive me, Ralph. But it's about Freeport status, and whether knowing that ABP have been designated or granted Freeport status for some activities in England, would Freeport status aid with the development of clean growth hubs surrounding your ports in Wales?
Yeah, thanks, John. So in England, these part of 4 that have been the process of Southampton in the southwest, as across through the Port of Garston. There isn't yet a mission for Freeports in Wales. I guess if it does follow, Freeports would be a really useful way of driving some of this clean growth forward. But there are other mechanisms where Welsh Government and local authorities can support this development. So Freeports could be good, but they're not the only way to do it, I would suggest.
No, thank you, Ralph. And I guess it's watch this space on that. And that sort of leads to the second question I have, which is perhaps for yourself, Ralph, but also for Tony and others, about the role that local authorities would have. Tony mentioned about planning being key, and this is a very joined up aspect. It has to bring a number of partners together. So I just wondered about the role that local authorities have. And perhaps, although proposals at this stage may be early stage, have local authorities been engaged with discussions about clean growth hubs?
Yeah, sure. Well, perhaps if I start and hand over to Tony. We're working very closely with the local authorities in and around our ports. A couple of them are actually SWIC members as well. So there is a real focus on this, and we feed into them through the local development plans to ensure the clean growth hubs and the sites that we've identified here are included within the development plan for employment uses and the like. So they're very actively engaged, and then specifically around the applications, obviously we consult with the authorities, but they're playing a pretty integral role in what we're doing in SWIC anyway. Tony, I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, within the cluster plan, we've actually got 2 local authorities as formal partners, which are Neath Port Talbot and Pembrokeshire. But we do have strong links to both city deals, and those city deals are quite crucial to this sort of planning. They're actually undertaking their own decarbonisation plans. So I think David Jukes is actually on this call. So David in particular from the deployment project within SWIC is in quite a lot of conversation with certainly Cardiff Capital Region. Could I bring you in there, David, please?
Yes, certainly, Tony. In answer to your question, John, yeah, we spend, there's a lot of dialogue that goes on with local authorities, Tony, myself, not just in the Swansea Bay area. We've had conversations with local authorities directly in the southeast around what their aspirations would be, how they would like to engage. And it is the Clean Growth Hubs has been included as part of the Cardiff Capital Region's energy strategy for industrial sites, and we're having ongoing conversations with them around how these can be developed and move forward. As Tony says, the industrial estates are huge employers within the South Wales areas, and it's important that we secure their future, and it's recognised by both of the regional city deals that Clean Growth Hubs can play an important part.
Just if I could add to that and sort of a follow-up question, clearly there's opportunities as both Ralph and Tony and you know have presented that you know for further investment, so inward investment into new developments. And I just wondered what role SWIC has in reaching out to those, I don't know, sweet spot new developments, new industries that might come, whether we need to have a sort of outreach activity to look at, you know, providing opportunities around some of the Clean Growth Hubs for new industry to come in. I think there's a perception perhaps that SWIC is about you know, our existing members, existing industries, but I just wondered about that, reaching out to new and symbiotic industry.
Should I go, Tony?
There you go. Yeah.
So it's not just local authorities, John. So we're actively talking to Welsh Government through the regional officers and their their leads. I think everybody acknowledges that this is a good thing and probably the right thing to do. It is extraordinarily complex, technically, from a planning point of view, and equally from a financial point of view. One of the things we're doing with the city deals and with the regional offices is exploring how best to pursue that. And one of the things that Tony and myself, I think we're also very careful of, is the unintended consequences. So we it's how we consider pushing down a certain direction that might have an unintended consequence that actually has a detrimental effect on an industrial site. One of the things that we are exploring, not just with the local authorities, we've started dialogue with individual organisations outside of SWIC in a more sort of conversations with the Wales Institute of Directors lead chair at the moment, so that we're having conversations around what the desire and what involvement the sort of actual boots on the ground companies that are involved are. One of the main things that we can do is, even though SWIC is a fairly new organisation, we've learned a huge amount of, we've gathered a lot of information, and those lessons learned can be transferred, not just into skills and into knowledge into the local, into further education and other skills groups, as well as into individual organisations, and that's all being discussed at the moment, but it is very complex and does take a lot of time.
Just to add to some of the things that David said, we're also, you can tell from my accent, I'm originate from the Midlands. So we're actually in contact with the small cluster, the Black Country cluster, and they're going through a very similar exercise around what they term in zero carbon hubs. And actually they're on a much smaller scale than South Wales. And what we're trying to do is make sure that between the two approaches, we're trying to learn lessons. So coming back to the finance, there are probably quite small, agile financial propositions on that small scale. If we're talking of very large steelworks or chemical works, we're probably looking at finances into the hundreds of millions scale. But actually, if we're looking at smaller industrial estates, we're hoping to actually pick up lessons learned from other clusters, basically. So we're not saying we've got the answers in South Wales. We are highly collaborative, both on the local scale, the Welsh perspective, and the UK perspective. So we're actually after people even from this call coming in and actually joining us. So we'd probably like to hold a bespoke session where people either with technology offerings, maybe with opportunities, or even an industrial estate that they would like to actually progress. So we actually will hold an open session probably in about 3-4 weeks to pursue that option. So
I was just going to say on that one as well. It's definitely a two-way thing. So we do get contacted by lots of various technologies and people with that have got some plans and about finding that sweet spot. It helps with a large array of partners and knowing sort of a bit about what the plans are and what waste heat they've got available and what space they've got around their sites and things like that. It does help to almost marry the applicable technologies to the right sort of sites. But yeah, it's an ongoing process, and things like that outreach that Tony's talking about is definitely a good way to move that on.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. Conscious there's only about 1 minute of the allotted time left, and there was just a general point that Chris had put in about the availability of slides, and Emma's put a note in the chat with a link to the YouTube channel. So just to clarify that, each of the seminars that we've got each day will be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and that link is in the chat there. I think that's about all we've got time for, but Tony, I'll just hand to you if there's any closing remarks that you'd like to make for the session.
I'd just like to say, actually, it's quite an exciting time. These clean growth hubs, the whole plans for South Wales and this SWIC week, you may have gathered from some of the conversations, presentations, we're sometimes maybe not as slick as other clusters and things like that, but actually we're quite holistic and integrated in our thinking, and we're very open to ideas and trying to actually find very practical ways forward. So we would actually appreciate further involvement from people. That would be appreciated. And with those comments, I don't see any further questions. So yeah, could we bring the session to a close, please, Katrina?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Cheerio.
Yeah.